No, my phone's just going to die partway through. It's in the charger, but the charger will slightly toggle a little bit from like someone touching the table, and we'll get unplugged and power down. Or not even that, sometimes it just likes to power down. I should have gotten a more reliable thing for this.
Yeah, that is my fault. You heard this.
Thanks.
Okay, good.
I didn't know that. I think so.
Is that how you went to the mic?
Yeah, yes.
Okay, thanks everybody for coming. We had a great turnout. And I'm happy to have Kevin give the FRC seminar today. And then, so Kevin's a master student, and this is also his speaking qualifier. So there's not a thesis, proposal, or defense, so just feel free to ask questions after, during, please just constrain yourself to clarification questions. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Basti. Alright, so we'll get started. First, thank you everyone for coming out today to attend my talk. So I'm going to be presenting my work on precision UAV landing in unstructured environments. And before getting started, I'd like to thank my committee, my advisor, Sebastian Shearer, also known as Basti, Professor Michael Case, and Sharia for helping me throughout this process, giving me advice, and making this all possible. So what do I mean by precision UAV landing? Here we have this nice figure. We're going to go back to this figure, or similar ones to it a lot throughout the talk. So here we have a drone starting on a small landing stone, or a small stone, and it's piloted up. Say the pilot's gone and flown the drone around a little bit, and we would like it to return home. It's come back with GPS to the approximate area of the takeoff zone, and we would like it to now land back accurately and precisely where it took off from. So the gist is, this is kind of an accurate, precise return to home functionality to get back to this landing block. And the unstructured portion comes into it, and that there is no type of structure added into the environment that the drone knows about prior to takeoff. So we have no types of landing pads or other things of that sort to tip off the drone as to where it took off from. So now that we kind of know what this is, why do we want something like this? It turns out drones don't always land in the most desirable manner. Here we have a drone coming down off the edge of the building, nicely rescued. Next we have a drone powering down and landing into a lake. You can see the hesitancy, whether you should go. Next, here we have another one. Will it make it to the land, or there's also another water hazard? You can see the pilots over there, they're not really sure yet. But as as it gets closer, it becomes a bit more clear. Once again, there's that hesitancy. I'd like to point out his friend was a lot closer. He could have got a lot easier. And now this nice beach landing. You can see the guy way over here. I guess with the current state of art, make sure you get some good cardio while you're flying your drone. So, we can see that drones don't always make the best decisions in where they land. A lot of times, or here in these videos you saw, they ended up powering down and starting to descend down into water. So we want our drones to be a bit smarter than that and safer. So we would like them to safely and accurately return back to their original position. And here's some examples of like unstructured environments. This patch of grass, we have added anything for the for context for the drone to use, or a patio, just take your drone out, fly around, and comes back safely. And we believe the accuracy piece is important, that if you do take off nearby something that is a bit more dangerous, such as a water hazard in the videos, if you do have even a few meters of error, could still end up landing in the edge of the water or something like that, and having to risk life, limb, and cell phone to save your drone. So now that we know what we're doing and why we're doing it, we'll get into some of the challenges of this task, the background of what other people have done in similar areas, as well as then our method of tackling this challenge, and then the results and conclusions. So first, where do you land? As the drone's returning home, as I mentioned, it's unstructured, so we haven't added anything to remind it this is specifically where you took off in the environment. So it has to figure this out on its own. And if we look at kind of current state of the art in research or drones, commonly drones will just use a GPS. This will be combined with other onboard sensors like an IMU, compass, and barometer to get some form of a state estimate. And the GPS provides or makes sure that there's no global drift overall, but it does still have fairly high error, particularly on smaller drones such as this. It could be upwards of a few meters. And as I mentioned, we would like it to be a bit more accurate than that. So even if you took off a couple meters away from the edge of the water, you would successfully make it back onto safe ground. This approach also does kind of get you back relatively in the area, so that's nice. Second approach is with structure. So in literature, there actually isn't work explicitly on landing in an unstructured environment, so without any type of landing pad for returning to home and accuracy in that landing. There is, however, a lot of work with landing pads, and then to kind of go over that a little bit, the idea is you attach some type of visual system. Commonly used ones are a downward-facing camera. There are also some other ones that will end up using a LiDAR system or some combination of these to assist in this, but as our work is focused on small drones that are more consumer aimed, we wouldn't want to use something quite as expensive or heavy as a LiDAR. But here are some of the example landing pads from a lot of different work. You have concentric circles, the classic helicopter pad, H, some funky ones with circular patterns, and then rectangles and other things like that. The overarching theme of these approaches is that you need to identify this structure in the environment. So concentric circles, use Huff transforms and identify these, or the H for the helipad, usually they'll train a neural network to find these H's in the environment. And then from that, you can get some type of somewhere between 3 DOF and 6 DOF pose estimate of the drone relative to that landing pad, and then use that to control and navigate your landing. And these types of approaches are used anywhere from like the general consumer approach to things such as ship deck landing, where you need to lock onto some landing pad. But here for the more general case, we would like to not have this, but the key kind of takeaway that I took from this is that these downward-facing sensors give you a pretty good insight to your area and can be quite helpful in this task of precision landing. So since we don't have that landing pad, that structure to have, we have our camera, how can we use that to assist us? There's another area of research, primarily spearheaded by Tim Barfoot's lab at the University of Toronto, called Visual Teach and Repeat. And the key idea here is that you navigate along a path that's been previously traversed. So primarily it's used on ground vehicles, such as the one seen here. And it's been RC'd along this path. It has a camera attached, you can actually see here, on the mast, and that will record these keyframes along the path. And then it will use visual odometry to navigate along a similar path on the repeat, and then identify these keyframes along those, and then use that to correct global drift along the path. So then you can have a globally accurate GPS denied navigation of your path. Some other work has also extended that, starting to go towards drones, but this is fairly preliminary. The example here, this kind of gives you the idea of learning phase or teach pass. It's recording these images along the path. And then in the replay phase or the repeat pass, it's going to identify those and use it to correct the drift of the state estimate along the way. But this work is primarily done in simulation, or if it's in the real world, it's with some pretty heavy assumptions that the drone can't actually change altitude and the teach pass has to be hand carried. So fairly limited, and we would like to, but this seems like a pretty interesting approach. Rather than the question of explicitly where do I land, you don't have to answer that anymore, you just have to navigate along this teach pass to get back to your starting position. So how do we use this? Here's kind of our version, following the takeoff path in reverse, so recording keyframes on the way up, and then using those to navigate back down to our initial position. So moving forward, what are some of the other challenges after we have our downward facing camera and the approach of retraversing the path? With the downward facing camera, field of view comes into play as an issue, since the distance from the ground more or less informs how much area on the ground you're gonna end up seeing. And when you're particularly close to the ground with standard pinhole lenses, this is gonna be quite limited as compared to when you're higher up in altitude. And you end up seeing this in the previous structured landing approaches, running those works running into this issue. So it kind of informed us that we had to be cognizant of this in moving forward. So some of their approaches in the structured landing world would be to use a variable landing pad size. So here this is a landing pad used in previous work where you have a larger outside pattern that can be identified at a higher altitude, and then use that to estimate your pose relative to the landing pad. And as you approach and your field of view decreases, you have this smaller pattern that you can still identify and localize to. But we don't quite have that for our approach. So another way is using multiple cameras. I mentioned the ship deck landing. This actually approach used a narrower field of view camera to identify the landing pad when further away. And then when in approach, it switched over to a wider field of view camera that was angled more directly at the pad. And this worked out nicely for that. But we would like to, on the smaller drone, limit the hardware and keep it as simple as possible. So ideally limiting it just to one camera. There's one other approach we found that used fisheye camera. So fisheye cameras tend to have very wide fields of view, upwards of 180 degrees or more, but they come at the cost of a high radial distortion. And but this works out for seeing a large amount of the ground when you're close to it. So to kind of give you guys a bit of a sense of what that looks like, here on the left is the pinhole camera that we had 1 meter above the ground, and then on the right is the fisheye camera. And they're both at 1 meter above the ground, and each of these patio tiles is about 1 foot by 1 foot. So you can see you get a whole lot more information, but it does, once again, come at the cost of this radial distortion. So in our approach, we end up siding with the fisheye lens, but we wanted to verify how well they worked at the task. So we do, and our experimental results show a comparison between the two to validate our choice of the fisheye lens. So now, wrapping up the challenges and background, the main challenges, as I said, are identifying where to land. And we do this by navigating along a similar path back to the starting position, rather than identifying explicitly where we took off from at the start. Next, for the field of view issue, we use a fisheye lens, which gives us a much wider field of view, which is helpful for the closer to the ground portions to still have enough information to get our position estimation from the takeoff images. And then our approach, we believe, contributes a working precision landing algorithm for unstructured environments, experimental results in various environments to show that it is robust to various scenes, and as well as an experimental comparison between the fisheye lens and the pinhole camera lens. So now we'll move into the approach for our method. So here, this is our hardware setup. We have the Autel XStar Premium drone. They're our sponsor for the project. And attached to it, we attached externally a downward-facing pinhole camera. This was used for the comparison. A laser rangefinder to get a better estimate of the current height of the drone during the landing. And then our fisheye camera for the actual landing portion. We additionally have NVIDIA Jetson TX2 attached. So this was that all the computation was done on board. We just simply had to send commands from the ground on when to land. Additionally, we have two primary assumptions. The first one is a flat ground plane assumption. So this we think is a fairly reasonable assumption, as when you go to take off your drone, you need the area to be fairly clear and flat to have a safe starting position. And then we can use this to get a better idea of the structure in the environment. And then finally, minimal scene change. Since we are using the images from takeoff, which gives us basically getting the scene environment that we use for information during the landing, that needs to have minimal change in it to be able to accurately still match to those images and get a pose estimate. But we do see how well this works later on in our experiments when this is broken. But we think it's a fairly reasonable assumption, as drone battery life is usually pretty short, somewhere between in the range of 10 to 20 minutes for your standard consumer drones. So the scene probably hasn't changed too much in that time frame. So moving forward, what does this look like? Here we have our task. We would like to navigate back to that starting position following a similar path to takeoff. And we accomplished it. So how do we do this? During the takeoff, I manually pilot the drone, and it's recording images. Here I avoid the tree because it's usually not good to fly into those. And as it descends, it's recording these images. Here we apply this arbitrary offset for our experiments. This is with the thought that after you take off or finish the takeoff, you've flown around and then return to home. Our algorithm starts once you're in the vicinity of the takeoff. And to get back there, we would use GPS. But we need to simulate some of this error that we expect to have with GPS. So we'd fly in some random direction to simulate that error. And then we start the landing. For this, you take a current image, we'll undistort the fisheye image, and then use orb features to match to one of the images from landing. From that, we get a position estimate and use that to directly feed into a velocity or a position controller and send velocity commands. Here, you'll see the drone coming down and landing. On the other side is the current image that is being compared, and it's being compared to the takeoff image. You'll see that the takeoff images is shifting as the drone descends, and the velocity commands changing during that process. Successful landing. So how do we do this? We have three primary sources of data coming in. The image data, height data, which we use on the drone, is coming from the laser rangefinder. We also, prior to testing this on a real drone, tested this in simulation. So we also use just ground truth height in the simulator. The state estimate, primarily from that, we're pulling the roll and pitch estimate, as well as using that to feed into the attitude control. So we have our, as I'll explain, the position controller sending velocity command, which then goes to the attitude controller. Then these three primary sources of data feed into, there's four main pieces to the pipeline. First, during the takeoff, you need to record keyframes. Second, the next three are actually all part of the landing. So once you've ascended and recorded these keyframes, you're ready to land. But during that landing process, you need to first select the image that you're going to compare to, then get a relative pose estimate to that, and then use that to control the drone back to its initial position, or potentially go into a recovery mode if something goes wrong in that process. So The two main steps of recording keyframes is to record these images record images, height data, and the roll and pitch data during the takeoff and based on a height threshold. So as it's taking off, once it surpasses in the first 2 meters, 1/10 of a meter, it'll record these keyframes. And then after that, until 7 meters, we'll record these keyframes every 1/4 meter. And to kind of get a visualization of what that looks like, here in the takeoff, it ascends a little bit, and at that spot, records a keyframe. And then as it ascends, records the next keyframe, and so on and so forth. And this will go all the way up until it finishes the takeoff. Then once you have all of these keyframes, we'll extract features from them, and for the fisheye camera, we would undistort it as well. So here's an example. During takeoff, we have our fisheye image, and then undistorting it to look more like a pinhole model-based camera. Here you can see this has a lot of radial distortion, and then when you unwarp it, you end up with a lot of interpolation that makes it look very blurred towards the edges. So this is why we did the comparison with the pinhole camera to see if this distortion ended up harming us more than it helped us with the wider field of view. So now that you've completed your takeoff, you've recorded your keyframes and extracted features out of them, and you want to start your landing, what do you have to do? You have to take your current image, extract the features from that, and then you need to choose an image from takeoff to compare to. And the way that we do this is based on height. The idea is you have your teach pass, you would like to compare to the image from that pass that is nearest below you. So what that looks like, here on the left is where our drone's starting on the landing, and then on the right is the drone from the takeoff. So we initially start in that position, we'll compare it to the drone that is once again nearest below. So that's that one immediately here, and then once it descends past that, it will switch to compare to images from the next keyframe that's been recorded. And we'll continue comparing to this one until once again it descends past that. And then here's an example of what a current image that's been matched with the takeoff image might look like, or what it does look like. So once we have this match, we need to get some type of estimate of our position relative to that. And the way we do this is that first we want to reduce the amount of unknowns we have in our problem as much as we can, so that the position estimation can be done as fast as possible. So we would compensate for the rotation first. So we have the roll and pitch data from our state estimate drones are equipped with, most drones are, or I think all drones are equipped with IMUs, so they'll have some form of this estimate that you can get of the current roll and pitch. And this will eliminate 2 of our unknowns of the equation and then make the estimation of our pose a little bit faster. Next, we have our flat ground plane assumption. So you take all of your points after you've corrected their position, and then knowing this estimated focal length from the undistorted fisheye image, you then can project those onto our flat ground plane. And then the points that have been matched from both the current image and then the takeoff image are now on the same ground plane. They're at the same Z height, and the only unknowns you have left are the X and Y position, as well as yaw. So that we can use, estimate a 2D rigid body transformation using ransack to reject any outliers in these matches. And then this is then we'll end up using this to go into the control. This more or less gives a general direction of the 2D offset from this image to this image. So if you shift it a little bit down and over, it would then be aligned with our image from takeoff. So once we have this pose estimate, how do we then use this to then go into control? So I mentioned we use ransack to estimate the 2D rigid body transformation. So the idea here is that you get some consensus of the points and how well you have this 2D rigid body transformation. And if the consensus is low, the thought is when that's happening, it's probably because the images are not well aligned. And then therefore your current position is a little bit too far offset from the current or from the takeoff path. So to recover from this and once again be able to start landing again, we go into this recovery mode when the consensus of the estimation is too low. So the drone will ascend to increase its field of view, and then continue trying to do these 2D rigid body transformation estimations. And once it has a consensus high enough, it then resumes the landing. And during the landing, we will use our position estimate to go into and use that for visual servoing. So the idea of visual servoing is more or less you use the camera-based position estimate to feed directly into the control. So an example of what that looks like, and this is for a robotic arm, you have the April tag, and it records some template image, and then you try to keep your current image matched or aligned with that template image as best as possible. So here, now that they're moving that, the arm is shifting such that its image matches with that template image. So for our approach, our template image is the image from takeoff, and then our current image is what we're trying to best align with that. And we do that, and specifically we try to align it in the X and Y. And while this is occurring, it constantly descends downward. And once it descends past that frame, it switches to the next one and repeats this process. So now that we know how the approach works, we'd like to get into our results and conclusions. So before starting the testing on the actual drone, we wanted to test this on a simulation system. Pretty good thing to do for drones, as sometimes they'll crash during experimentation. So we'd like to make sure that my algorithm isn't going to crash the drone. So here our setup was, we had a downward facing pinhole camera in the simulation. We used the ground truth for the height estimate and roll and pitch. And then we still have our primary assumptions of the flat ground plane and minimal scene change. The simulator we used is called AirSim. It's using Unreal Engine for the graphics, so you end up with this nice photorealistic simulation. And here we can see how it works. So the drone was commanded to execute some diagonal path, and when it passed about here is when it finished recording takeoff images and continued along that. So it was actually a few meters offset from where the final takeoff position was, or takeoff recording was. And then from here we would initiate, and that's kind of that arbitrary offset. So we'd initiate the landing. And as the drone approaches, once it's at a height of 1 meter, it will pause and try to align with the image from takeoff at that height as best as possible before commanding a final downward descent. So here, about this height, it's not on the ground yet, it looks like it, but it's actually trying to do that final alignment. And then once it's happy with that, it finishes the descent. And overall from this, we ended up with a average accuracy of 17 centimeters, which we were pretty happy with and decided to move forward into the real world testing. So to remind you, here's our physical setup. In these experiments, we're using the fisheye camera attached to it to inform our descent and navigate back down to the original position. The laser rangefinders for height, and all the computation is happening on board. Additionally, on board the drone is a IMU and GPS extended Kalman filter. We would like to compare against that as our baseline to see how much our algorithm improves past this current state-of-the-art approach of landing. And then once again, our assumption is flat ground plane and minimal scene change. So here's another few examples of our approach. Here's on a grass spot. So we take off and apply a pretty reasonable horizontal error off to the side, and then begin our landing. And you see from our approach, it quickly addresses that horizontal offset and continues the landing. You'll see it pause for a brief moment once it's slightly above the ground for that final alignment, and then descends. We also wanted to test this in a few other environments. So here's the turf, football field, campus. super fast runner in the background. And another grassy environment. So we specifically compared with the extended Kalman filter on board using the GPS and IMU in the grass environment and the patio environment from the first example. And here you can see the precision landing algorithm far outperforms the GPS IMU extended Kalman filter running on board, both in terms of accuracy and precision. We also took note of a nearby airport's estimation of the wind velocity and max gusts during the time frame we were testing, since in the testing there was a pretty noticeable difference in how gusty it was, and the precision landing was being tested during windier days and still managed to perform quite well. So we think that this shows that even if with the wind pushing the drone off course a little bit, given our approach, we can then correct for that and come back on track and still land accurately. Next, we wanted to compare the how well the fisheye performed in relation to the pinhole camera. So these are recordings from the same takeoff and landing. They're a little bit out of sync, so I apologize for that. But here you can just kind of get an idea of how much more information we're gaining from the fisheye camera as compared to the pinhole camera. And now it's beginning the descent. And comes back down to that initial position. Here once again, this is fairly close to the ground, so you lose a lot of information in the nearby surrounding area. So then we compare these two methods by looking at the number of times that the 2D rigid body estimation had low consensus, so bad position estimates, and the pinhole camera had a reasonably higher amount, particularly than the fisheye, particularly in the start of the takeoffs. This is when it's between 8 and 6 meters in altitude, and then at the end of the landing when it's just about 2 meters above the ground. And we think that this is because with the narrower field of view, if there is a fairly large offset at your starting position, then you'll end up, the fisheye camera, or no, the pinhole camera won't even be able to really get that initial estimation of pose. So then the fisheye camera with a much wider field of view has enough overlap to do that. And then at the final portion of the landing, once again, since the narrow field of view, you're missing out on a lot of information. If the takeoff path close to the ground was a bit more horizontal, and those two images didn't align very well, as you shift to the next image, you might not have enough overlap to get a good position estimate during the landing. So I think that this validates our choice of the fisheye camera. Next, we wanted to see how well our algorithm worked if we broke some of the assumptions. So what if something in the scene changed, like an ambulance? You drove your ambulance out and flying your drone, and then you decide that this spot had a nicer view of whatever's in front of you, and you want your drone to start returning home. It turns out this can be confusing for our algorithm and draws the drone off course. Interesting note here, you notice that it's landing at the corner of the shadow there. It took off from the corner of that shadow. So here we can see that there is this strong set of features over on the ambulance that was able to have a high enough consensus to draw the drone off course. But relatively, it still kind of landed accurately. So here is another view of that at the finishing of the takeoff. The ambulance started about 4 feet away from the takeoff position, and then the yellow box shows approximately where the drone landed, which was over by the ambulance, which has now moved 16 feet away from that takeoff position. So it can fail when there's a strong feature set moved in the scene, but it does fail in a predictable manner. We decided to continue testing with this. So what if the van was moved very far away, more or less removing that feature set from our takeoff recording, or during the landing, from the view of the camera? So now we move the van way out to the side. The fisheye camera does have, I can't still see it, but if in the undistorted version, it will be highly distorted, so the features won't match as well. Here, lands quite nicely. That rock and pen were visual markers for the takeoff position. And so here we moved the ambulance 41 feet away from the initial takeoff position, and the yellow box kind of qualitatively marking where it landed back. So this worked quite nicely. And then one more comparison where we keep the ambulance further away, and then once again shift it to the 41 feet position. So we're curious to see maybe if this performed even better than the other one, since the ambulance would be in fewer of the takeoff images, takeoff keyframes. So how does this data look, or once again, here we go. Qualitative landing position, ambulance moved 41 feet away from the initial takeoff position. So here's the quantitative data for that. We ran 5 tests for each run. So for the moving the van from 4 feet away to 16 feet away, quite regularly ended up landing over by the van again. So inaccurate. But it did have one edge case where it came back and landed approximately where it took off from, so that was nice. Then in the other 2 cases where we moved the ambulance very far away, it generally would land back approximately where it took off from. Each one did have one edge case where the drone flew about 41 feet all the way over to land once again nearby the ambulance. So from this, we think that if we, even with some scene change, particularly with scene change, if you take a strong set of features and remove those from the image, there will still be enough features in the environment to successfully navigate back to your starting position. But if you take a strong set of features and move it to a different position, this can be very confusing for the algorithm. So now, in conclusion, we've presented an algorithm across all the different environments we tested in. Where there was minimal scene change, we had 40 centimeters average accuracy, which did significantly better than the GPS IMU version. We also think that given that it landed successfully in these windy environments, that it showed that it was fairly robust to wind and other disturbances. It could be tested, we tested in grass, the rocky environment from the scene change, patio, etc. So it works fairly well in various environments. And that the fisheye lens ends up providing more information for this task of precision landing in an unstructured environment than the pinhole. And from that, just as a encouragement to then the research community that this could be a better source or a better sensor to use for that task if you're doing something similar. And then finally, it's robust to features being removed from the image. As future work, there's a lot of ways that this then could be improved even further. So one way that we would like to improve it would be to switch. I mentioned that we're using the state estimate for the attitude to feed into the attitude control and assist in that. We would like to try switching over to a visual inertial state estimate that we can then use for that to then do a lower level control and not have the GPS in the pipeline at all. So then we could run this in a completely GPS denied environment. Additionally, the visual surveying that we did was the position controller with it was only a PI controller, so quite simple. And a lot of the other previous precision landing works end up using these adaptive controllers, and they tend to perform quite well, particularly in the final portion of the landing, when you with any wind disturbances or ground effect. Additionally, to kind of robustify the takeoff procedure and the images that you record as keyframes, using the change of field of view rather than the height would be a much better measure of what is a helpful keyframe to have. Additionally, looking at the current rate of change of the roll and pitch, as well as what the roll and pitch are estimated at, and only recording images that are fairly level with the ground and aren't rotating if the pilot takes an aggressive motion during the takeoff. And then potentially adding something like a bit more semantic understanding in the scene. If we could have identified the van and noticed that it had shifted relative to a lot of the other things in that scene, then we could just ignore those features and still land accurately if these strong feature sets move. And finally, as an extension, since it was drawn off course by this strong feature set, what if we took a highly textured landing pad, took off from a straight path from that, and then moved that around in some environment? We think it might end up working to navigate back to that and still land. So extra feature from the algorithm. So finally, as a key insight, we can take a drone and that can land back to its original takeoff position via following images from a downward-facing fisheye camera from the takeoff in reverse. And we think that this is a helpful thing to the research and consumer community. So with that, I would like to thank all of those that have helped me in this process. A lot of people could have done this without them. So, and additionally, and with that, I would like to now open the floor for any questions. Thank you.
So, in using the fisheye camera, I noticed that you had a lot of obstruction from the rangefinder as well as the landing gear on the drone. So did that affect your feature matching between images or anything like that?
Since we more or less know where those items are, we can ignore them, and also even without ignoring them, there is generally enough features in the scene that those are rejected as outliers from the range side.
Oh.
But yeah, they're more or less always in the same position. So this is the leg of the drone. That's the other. That's the laser rangefinder. Just as to point out. Yeah.
I was also wondering, how high did you test this? What altitude did you?
Yeah. So we would stop the image recording at about 7 meters and be approximately within a meter of that height to start the takeoff, and then several meters horizontally. Saki?
Do you think the shadows will play a big role on the current algorithm? I think on cloudless, sunny day like this, as the drone moves closer to ground, it will predominantly see its own shadow. Would it use that as a strong feature so that it will land anywhere as long as the shadows?
Yeah, that was an issue and a failure case in a few times on particularly sunny days in the more feature or less feature-rich environments. So generally wasn't too much of an issue for it, but occasionally was drawn off course by that shadow. So need to address that in future work. You will?
Just the light under the drone. Put a flashlight there. During takeoff and landing.
Yeah. How about you? Sudhu?
So I guess your work makes one assumption that the images you get are somewhere in the neighborhood of the template images you have. Assuming you can operate a drone for 20 minutes, you can get kind of far away from that such that your images are either in the fringes of the fisheye, which might be bad estimates, or it might be completely outside the template image. So do you have any ideas for course moves to get back to that?
Yeah, so the general thought was that we could use the GPS to get generally back to that area. So the goal would be the GPS brings you back to the position of the final image recorded in takeoff, and that should only have a few meters worth of error. And given that, we tested the algorithm kind of in that range. So it is possible that it does go too far away though. And then this would be kind of the thought, if you go up a little bit higher, hopefully then those images match, but there is an outer bound where it no longer can successfully navigate back. Charlie?
Around slide 42, you mentioned something around 8 to 10% bad matches. What was your criteria for determining the match was bad?
Yes, that was looking at the consensus of the rigid body transformation, I think we looked at if it was lower than like 30%, because of the overall matches that this is the best consensus that we have from our feature match set, then we determined that as a bad landing spot, or as a bad match.
How did you determine consensus?
So from Ransack, the idea is you take some random sample size and then estimate your 2D rigid body transformation, and then if you apply that to all the points, how well they actually match then their corresponding point, and if that error is above some threshold, then that's not an inlier. So from that, I can't remember what our threshold was for that, but as long as if under 30% of those matched up within their position, then it was assumed to be a bad match, and that we shouldn't use that and go into a recovery mode.
Right.
Yeah.
Have you encountered any environment where you don't have enough features? So I noticed on the lawn there were leaves.
Yeah, that was, I hadn't yet encountered that. I was expecting, it did perform worse in grassy environments, particularly long grass. So that was probably, it's not that there aren't enough features, but then once you get too close, or once you get close to the ground, the downwash from the props end up moving the features around too much, and you can't get your good estimation there. But in a lot of, like, there's one spot on campus over by the playground that has fairly short grass that was off to the side and testing, and when you got close to the ground, there was a bunch of leaves stuck in the mud. So those ended up providing good features. But yeah, this would likely fail in a low feature rich area.
So I mentioned that the difference to the fisheye lens would be significant there, since it could also see structures further away.
Yeah.
Does it get features from structures that are fairly to the side? Or?
Yeah, so you will end up with stuff like that. So here's an image from high altitude with feature matches. So actually most of the feature matches are on like the edges of the bush. This is a table. And then once you're close to the ground, there's still some from like the bush in the extremity, but some of those leaves also from the ground. So yeah, that is one thing that using the wider field of view camera gets us those images. And even though it might not quite be on the same ground plane in real life or in actuality, it still allows us to get the 2D rigid body transformation in practice.
What if you didn't have a laser on board?
So without the laser on board, most drones do have barometers, so we could look at using that for the additional height estimate. The laser isn't, I think, super necessary. I didn't test this out, so I can't quite confirm quantitatively, but you can just get a relative estimate of position error from the pixels and feed that into the controller, and then without then having an idea of the altitude. But so I don't think it would completely break the algorithm, but potentially perform a little worse, since you don't have a more of a metric understanding of your position error.
And then, so what values from the state estimate are really required for your algorithm?
Really just the roll and pitch estimate for correcting the angular rotation, and then the rest is used on the control side. So then that's the full 6-stop codes will be feeding into that, but at least for the position estimation and things like that, just the roll and pitch.
Can you go back to slide 33? You actually had a really good question just about it. Okay. A few slides before this, where you have this projected 3D part, right? So my understanding here was that you were using, so after you compensated the feature points by rotation, you were using the altitude estimate from your laser rangefinder to then put them on the same plane, right? So, but then now if you don't have a good estimate of the height, wouldn't that affect
yeah, so it would,
whether it would be projected?
I guess yes, another piece in that, since you couldn't assume that they were on the same ground plane, that does mess things up a little bit. With the, I think also with the images being relatively close in height, since the thresholding was fairly small, it wouldn't have too large of an effect, but if you did have an image that was a bit further off, such that then you couldn't get that 2D rigid body transformation without understanding the scale there, then that would mess this up.
So basically when you're closer to the ground, do worse, but when you're super high up, the small errors in your altitude estimate from barometer and GPS would not be that significant.
Yes.
I had another question, which is regarding those images that you're saving when you're taking off. So you mentioned later on that you were saving them on, or you want to save them only when there's little roll and pitch. Was that
as-
the statement you had made?
Yeah, it could be potentially helpful.
Right, but in these experiments, the takeoff images were taken at whatever roll and pitch angle the pilot
Yes.
was flying at, right? So one question I had was that, have you thought about, like, for example, so say for example, a pilot could be taking off very aggressively, like always pitching to the right, because if there's say that tree was extending further to the right, right?
Mhm.
In that case, if you only wanted to have this threshold, you would end up saving very few images, right? But I feel like you've got this really good attitude estimator on board, right?
Mhm.
So you've got these roll pitch values, and even yaw, for a short while. Have you thought about any kind of like standard vision algorithm that you could use to change this image at an angle to a planar? Is there like a mapping or projection transform that you could use to save them?
Yeah, you could get, I think then, or like more or less use like finding like a homography, warping it to being
Right.
flat. So maybe then the better thing would be, rather than looking at, if you are at a more constant angle, you can correct for that. I think the primary thing in that statement was more so the rate of change, in that if you are turning quite a bit in roll and pitch, you'll end up with very blurry images. And then there were a couple failure cases where I took a very sudden rotation, and that image was recorded and it wasn't able to successfully match during the landing. So the thought would be to reject things like that. And once it finished and leveled out or stopped, if it even stayed a bit constant at that, it could record the image and have good matches.
So I'm wondering, when you take the keyframes, you don't record any state estimate.
Just the roll and pitch and then the height. So those are all recorded as like part of the keyframe.
So if you were to record the odometry at that point, would that help you in control? You basically know the offset to use image.
Yeah, it could be helpful in creating something of a feed-forward type of input. So as you're approaching the current image, you know the position offset to the next image, and then I use that to assist in starting that. So when it switches image, the control input is less drastic.
I had another point of clarification. So when you said visual servoing, because I recall back in the day when we had this visual servoing with the arms, the whole idea was you went straight from like image space to control inputs for the joints. So are you doing something similar for your drones? Are you going from image space to motor outputs, or?
As in that sense, not quite directly. It's just more so using the image position estimate directly to feed into the control. So it's
Okay, so it's at the end of it, it's just basically PD on poses.
yeah.
Okay.
What's the impact of landing speed on accuracy?
This isn't something I quite tested. It would be something nice to test. Generally, I would think there would be like a bound in how fast you could come in at, but with the added kind of recovery behavior, if you descended a little too quickly, you notice that go back up and kind of restart descending at a quick speed. But it's more so the impact would be in how quickly you can compensate for any horizontal difference between the two images in that time when you're descending before switching to the next image. And if you had a more horizontal path, if you didn't correct for that, you'd end up too far offset and you wouldn't be able to match. Outside of that, I don't think I could see it affecting it too greatly. I chose a bit of a slower speed just to be conservative and make sure it would work. What's up?
So So when you take off, you're taking different, I guess, frames for reference later when you want to land. Were those like discrete, or did you like plan like during each frame that there's like a specific feature that might be helpful?
No, it was discrete. So there, it was just like at that height threshold. Once you pass it, record that.
Did your, I guess you're using like an SF30 or something, right?
Mhm.
So for the laser rangefinder, whenever you land on an object that has some height to it like that, did you take that step into account?
I did not, since trying to keep that like without knowing anything. There is a potential of this hindering the algorithm if you took off of something that is significantly above ground and you shift over to something that's lower than. That, I guess, a significant thing, you'll end up skipping a lot of keyframes because you'll suddenly jump up in altitudes. That's part of the reason why the change of field of view would be helpful in this, such that then when you say, when in the grassy area there was this offset here, it's actually the grassy environment, it's right over there. So when moving over that, you wouldn't miss out on a bunch of keyframes. That's like something like 0.75 meters, so then you wouldn't miss out on all that.
I had a minor question for the ambulance videos. First of all, I really like the ambulance video because I think it does a very sensible thing, which is to say, like, you know, when the most dominant features move, it does the best you can do given the data that you have, right? One question I had was I didn't see your drone doing that random offset thing that you had in the other videos.
It's a little difficult in the. I was supposed to stay on there and pause. It's a little difficult from the fisheye perspective at a high altitude to see the offset. So that like little jiggle was actually like offsetting it by a little bit.
And so the other question I had was that since the majority of the features is moving away from the image space, I would have actually expected it to go into your recovery mode.
It actually does here.
I see.
But there's enough features, so it quickly here for a moment pauses, and you'll see it go up a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually like a moment of recovery mode.
I see.
But the consensus was with the features on the ambulance.
It seems that for when it's sort of following the set of features that's moved in the scene, the GPS should be able to know that it's like way off from where it started. So you could potentially use that as a way to check whether the features you're tracking are actually part of the same set you thought they were from the beginning.
That could be one way. I think we were trying to avoid the GPS as much as possible. So that's why, as like future work, looking at some like scene understanding to then identify that those have shifted. But yeah, that could also, if it goes offset too far, then in the wrong direction, then chances are that would be that could inform us. So,
like how repeatable are just like the raw motor commands to the drone in like the XY direction? So like when you're doing the teach phase, I was wondering if you could just like teach it some of the raw motor commands and then potentially feed that in.
Yeah, for this drone, not so much, and it also is additional of the. So there are some like hardware issues with this drone. So there's fun moments. Let's get to it here where it's landing. You'll see it descend really fast, and that's from like if it had too low a battery and a strong gust of wind came by, the motors would like saturate and suddenly start dropping. So I called it skyfall mode, and there it did it just like a little bit. So since there's these other disturbances that you have to take into account, I wouldn't think that'd be too successful, and also like given that your starting position has some error.
Another question. So for your pinhole cameras, you never specified what your field of view of your lens was. Because I mean, I can choose an arbitrarily high zoom lens and it'll give me a really bad field of view, right?
I think I'll have to double check back at the data. I should have looked that up before the talk, but I think it was around like somewhere between 70 and 90 degrees, and I guess just for the this one, I guess, like with 1 meter above the ground, you can see about 3 feet width and height. But, so I don't think it was overly narrow for the view. Sherry?
So for your recovery mode, is it like it goes directly up?
Yes.
So how do you think that would perform in like your first picture where there was like a big tree and then suddenly like, what if the consensus filter was like, okay, we don't
Could
know.
be bad. I actually haven't thought about it.
So like, is there like is it just straight off like, I'm just gonna go up, or is there like a weighting that you can do?
No, it's set just to be straight up, so yeah, that would be an issue. Hopefully it doesn't overshoot that far in the wrong direction, but yeah, so it doesn't keep any like recording or math of other objects in the environment to try to avoid explicitly, so it could end up going up into a tree.
Like, what are cases where it usually, the consensus filter says that it should go into recovery mode?
It generally was when like the image was a bit too offset. So like then the feature matches were a bit all over the place since it was matching to random things, rather than features that actually made sense.
I think you just need another laser rangefinder.
Might need a little bit more information in that since it's a bit sparse in the tree.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Kevin.
Thank you guys.